From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Let's talk just a little bit more about the Republicans and what they might do going forward legislatively, Kyle. Obviously, without the Senate, not going to pass a lot, but their priorities, I think, are going to be things like energy policy. They're going to try to liberate oil and gas. They're going to try to do something about the border, immigration. They certainly want to increase defense spending. They're going to push on school choice. And I think big tech, perhaps regulation and woke companies are going to be a preoccupation, maybe more of investigation and hearings than actual legislation. You know, they also have to pass a budget, of course. They'll try to get some extensions of the 2017 tax cuts. But all of this legislatively is going to require 60 votes in the Senate and Democratic cooperation, because the lack of a Senate Republican majority means that they cannot pass a Republican-only budget that could pass with 51 Senate votes. And that means that the House Republicans will have to negotiate almost from the start with Democrats.
Correct. And there may be some things that you mentioned that could get over the line. I mean, before the election, we had this long, protracted negotiation about Senator Joe Manchin's permitting ideas, and they did not pass. And so that is a talk that is probably expected to pick up again. And maybe there's ways that the Republican takeover of the House can strengthen the argument for some serious federal permitting reforms, and that's something that maybe Joe Manchin can get over the finish line in the Senate. So there are some deals that can be made. Maybe the border situation has gotten to such a crisis level that there's some kind of agreement the House and Senate can find and get to President Biden's desk and get a signature on. But the other side of it is just presenting legislation and passing legislation and making the argument to the public that this is a better kind of governance and this is the other option that you have. I mean, there were some complaints, particularly by Rick Scott in the Senate, that the Republicans did not have a governing agenda. There was no real contract with America, as in 1994, that was put forward by the Republicans opposing the Democratic Congress. Rick Scott tried to do a little bit of that himself. But now we're entering a period where for 2 years, what is coming out of the Republican House, that will be the agenda. That will be what they will run on in 2024 when they say, please put us back in charge of the House, put us back in charge of the Senate, and maybe the White House, too, to get some of the stuff signed.
Well, and from a policy point of view, there's no question that just having control of the House means that, let's say there's a recession and there's a political pressure to do something for growth. You know, if the Democrats controlled everything, their answer was going to be just spend more money, strict demand-side Keynesian policy. With the House in Republican hands, there would have to be some negotiation over taxes and tax cutting and incentives. And that's when you could open the door to deals that might include, say, an indexing of capital gains taxes or some other pro-growth business return to 100% expensing, which is starting to go away in January. That's where you could see measures, and that's very significant. Let's turn to the Senate, Kim, for a bit and talk about the challenge that Rick Scott made late, the Florida senator, to Mitch McConnell and his leadership. McConnell now will be the longest-serving majority leader of either party in the Senate. I mean, he staged a 37-10 relatively easy victory over Scott, who really didn't have that much of a case after running the Republican Senate Campaign Committee this year and not retaking the majority. But what significance do you attach to Rick Scott's challenge in getting those 10 votes?
So Rick Scott was channeling some frustrations that you see among certain members in the Senate. And it kind of touches on what you were just talking about in terms of opportunities. You were talking about the possibility of some sort of indexing of capital gains or extending some of the 2017 tax cuts. Republicans are very unified around this. There's a frustration in the Senate over some of McConnell's decisions to instead work with the Democrats on spending issues. You know, and this is one thing we've knocked McConnell on over the years. He's an appropriator at heart. And there's still a lot of lingering resentment that Republicans were kind of given the green light by McConnell to go over and work with Democrats on that infrastructure bill that passed last year, the giant semiconductor blowout that happened this summer. and the frustration they feel as though a lot of these deals are made in McConnell's office or in his consultation with Chuck Schumer, and that rank and file aren't being able to really express their will of what they'd like to see get done. Now, I can kind of see that. I wasn't a fan of either of those bills. At the same time, let's not forget that when McConnell passed that infrastructure bill, it was part of a bigger strategic plan he had to try to keep Joe Manchin on side and make sure that Joe Biden's bigger agenda didn't go through. And for a while, that seemed to have worked out right up until this last summer when Manchin suddenly changed his mind and decided to do the final little bit of that Build Back Better agenda. So it didn't pan out because I think what everyone understands is that overall, McConnell has been a very strong and strategic leader for the caucus, more so than most Republican leaders in my memory in the Senate, and that he's done well on issues like judges, etc. And also Rick Scott, just not the greatest candidate, having just come out of not a wonderful cycle as NRSC chair. But it is going to require McConnell and the leadership to listen a little bit more to some of these concerns, especially on the spending side.
Yeah, he didn't come out of that, though, sounding as if he needed to make a lot of concessions. He was asked if the fact that there was a challenge required him to listen more. And he said, well, look, any 5 members, we have a process where any 5 members can bring up a subject and come and make sure we have a conference about it. So, no, we don't need to change anything else, which is kind of classic McConnell. Before we go, we have just heard the announcement by Speaker Nancy Pelosi that she will remain a member of Congress in the minority, at least for the time being, but she will not seek a leadership position again, which is going to open the Democratic Party to perhaps certainly new leaders and perhaps a new generation. But let's talk some before we go about Nancy Pelosi's legacy. My own personal view is that she was the strongest House Speaker maybe since Tom Reed in the early part of the 20th century. Speaker Reed, Boss Reed, was the guy who was Republican. He famously said the duty of a minority is to vote and provide a quorum. And that's it. He ran the House that way. And Pelosi was able to maintain party discipline and accomplish an enormous deal for Democratic priorities. Those are progressive priorities. Those were not my priorities for the most part. We fought an awful lot of them. One place where we agreed, I think, is on China policy and human rights and the focus there. And she certainly understood China. Maybe that was from her strong Chinese emigre population in San Francisco, where she was from. She probably learned some of her tactics of political control and discipline from her family of Baltimore ward healers, Democratic machine, Baltimore machine politicians. Kyle, what do you make of Pelosi's legacy?
Well, I generally think that's right. I mean, the things I would point to as her high points are her strength on human rights, her visit to Taiwan this summer, which caused a furor, her visit earlier this year to Kyiv, Ukraine, when the Ukraine war broke out. And I agree with you that her ability to make moderates walk the plank, to pass her party's priorities, is what allowed them to accomplish and pass the laws that they did. And Obamacare, I think, is a good example. And to that sense, I mean, I think that she knew what political power was for, which was passing laws and changing policy. And, you know, if you had told her at the time that if you pass Obamacare the way that you will spend the next several years in the political wilderness and get wiped out at the federal level, at the state level, but that the law would ultimately stand, I'm not sure that she wouldn't have taken that deal.
She'd have taken that deal in a Baltimore minute.
Well, she knew. She did know, and she did take it.
And just as a point on that, you know, they had at that time 257 House Democrats in that 2009, and they lost the majority. You know, that is a huge defeat. But I know that people view Obamacare as a significant part of her legacy and was willing to risk the House for it. Now, the other thing that will be a big part of her legacy this time is the Inflation Reduction Act, because even more than the huge spending bill that she passed in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act has elements like green spending and subsidies and drug price controls that will do enormous damage to the future, the drug pricing thing in particular, to drug innovation. But Democrats like price controls. So that's, I think, a legacy item, certainly for the Democratic left. And then the green subsidies are going to push fossil fuels even more out of certainly the electricity mix, Kim.
Yeah, Pelosi has got a number of things that will last for a long time. Now, as you note, many of them I find very problematic for the economy and for entitlements and for the future of the country. But they'll go down on the scoreboard next to her name. Now, I would just point out, to go to Kyle's point, though, for as much as we can all admire Nancy Pelosi for what she called an iron fist and a velvet glove, or other people have said, that it has cost Democrats politically and changed the shape of its party. You have to wonder what the country would look like if Nancy Pelosi had listened to all of her caucus members back when she had 250 members and decided to pass something that was a little bit more palatable to all of them rather than marching them across the line. She chose instead to go in a more progressive fashion with a lot of this legislation. And the result was that she did lose that majority. And moreover, Democrats were shut out of a lot of states. You know, the Blue Dog Caucus, which was always the moderate caucus, often in a lot of states in the South, it's essentially gone. And the Democratic Party has been reduced more to a coastal and urban entity. So those are some of the costs of that form of governance. But you can weigh that out. But I would say that her legacy isn't entirely, all flowers for the party.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But on the other hand, I'm just talking about sheer ability to leverage power and use it for the ends you desire. And if Kevin McCarthy could be 3/4 as successful, or maybe half as successful as that, he could have a successful speakership. But it'll be fascinating to see and significant to see whether or not he can do that. Kyle, just a last word on Hakeem Jeffries. Looks like he's going to challenge the New York Congressman Nancy Pelosi to succeed her. Maybe Steny Hoyer, her deputy for years, will stand against him. We don't know yet. But I think Hakeem Jeffries is probably, he's in his 50s, I think. He's probably the odds-on favorite, and he's a prominent progressive.
Right, and there are some strengths for him. Having a generational shift, I think, might be good for the party's image in some of these House seats as we're going into the next round of elections. But I do wonder whether he can keep the caucus together in the same way. And one thing that I think is the question is, to your point, I think that he is more on the progressive side of the aisle. So he sides with the squad members on the substance of some of these things, which might make it tougher for him to ask them to walk the plank when they need to get the budget passed. And so what I think is notable about this is we've had a period here where we have had very strong, cohesive Democratic leadership in the House and very divided, disunited, chaotic leadership on the Republican side of the House. And we may just be going back to an era where we have chaos on both sides of the House. And so what a world we live in, what a place to be as a journalist covering all this.
I'm not so sure about that. I think I might put a couple bucks on that for you, Kyle. I think the Hakeem Jeffries is likely to be pretty powerful Democratic speaker. And he has squabbled with Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, in the past over whether or not she, for example, should challenge moderates in districts that are swing districts. And so he's a pretty savvy political player. All right. Kyle, Kim, thank you. Thank you all for listening. The political comedy continues, and we will cover it here on Potomac Watch 5 days a week. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.